If you go to your local home improvement store and you look for garage floor epoxy, you'll probably end up seeing one of these products. And you might read a list of features like self-leveling or mold and mildew resistant or UV fade protection. And you might see all kinds of different ways that they try to explain how strong their product is. This information can be pretty overwhelming and sometimes misleading. A lot of it is based in truth, but expressed in marketing. And you can bet that if you hire a professional epoxy installer, they're not going to show up to your house with one of these DIY installation kits, or even the epoxy that comes with the DIY installation kit. They're going to show up with an industrial grade epoxy that you can't buy on a home improvement store shelf. But you can still get industrial grade epoxy as a DIY consumer. I've linked the product that I use in the description below. But before I make a product recommendation to you, I want to try to appear objective. So let's talk about some of those features and which ones you actually need to pay attention to, which ones are misleading. And yes, I will be doing most of this video on one knee. If an epoxy says that it's self-leveling, that doesn't mean that it's going to level off any low spots on your floor, fill in any cracks or imperfections on your floor. It simply means that as you're making a pass with a roller or a trowel or a squeegee, whatever you're using to apply your epoxy, it's not going to leave ridges or streaks at the edges of your pass. It's not going to leave roller marks or anything like that. They're going to flatten out on their own as it dries or as it hardens. It's also not going to leave puddles or patches if you happen to apply it a little bit thicker in one area versus another. If you do have low spots that you want to level off, or any imperfections that you'd like to fill in, you can do that in advance with a skim coat of concrete. It's not that difficult and it's really not expensive to do it yourself. It can be tedious, and I've covered this in another video about resurfacing as you're preparing to apply epoxy. Assuming your surface is nice and smooth, you've prepared it in advance, or you've got a clean sheet of concrete to work with, the best way to ensure that you don't have streaks or ridges in your epoxy as you're applying it is to work in small batches. So only prepare as much epoxy as you can work with in a 15 to 20 minute increment. And that's going to ensure that it doesn't start to block up on you or start to get tacky as you're applying it, and it will stay fluid enough that it will flatten out on its own. And that goes for any grade of epoxy you're working with. Some of the higher grades don't advertise themselves as self-leveling because they're thicker, and they might need to have a thinning agent applied to them. Well, my knees are already killing me, but let's talk about mold and mildew resistance, because I've seen a lot of epoxies advertise mold and mildew resistance as part of their formula. Some even advertise a biocide. And it is true that you can add silver and zinc and things that have antimicrobial properties to the formula, and they will kind of give you a little bit of that mold and mildew resistance, but the idea of some kind of insurance policy against mold and mildew across your garage floor is a bit of a stretch, in my opinion. All it takes is a thin layer of dust to separate that mold and mildew from the surface of your epoxy where that antimicrobial coating is, and if they're not making contact with the antimicrobial coating, then they can grow. A razor thin layer of dust or grime is all it takes to create a surface for mold and mildew to grow. Mold and mildew spores are microscopic. They can grow almost anywhere. First thing that you've already done is that you've decided to apply an epoxy, and that's going to help eliminate porous surfaces from your garage floor, because concrete is very porous and therefore it can retain water, whether it's wicking up from under the ground or whether it's coming in through a wall or something like that. And once it's on your concrete, the concrete can retain it, and that's when mold and mildew can start to become a problem. So if you're spreading epoxy, you're eliminating that porous surface. One thing that I will say about mold and mildew resistant epoxies is they can help when it comes to stains from mold and mildew, because mold and mildew will stain anything that it grows on. You do need to still keep it clean. It will give you a bit of an advantage in preventing against those stains, but what I would recommend instead is adding a top coat to any type of epoxy that you put down, which will help prevent against any kind of stains, not just mold and mildew, but automotive fluid, chemicals, anything that might end up on your epoxy will give you that extra layer of protection, so that if you need to really, scrub or use chemicals to clean, or scour or anything like that, you're doing that on the top coat layer as opposed to on the epoxy itself. And then you can reapply this if you need to. It's kind of like, the finish coat on your car. These are very easy to apply. They're not expensive no matter what brand you go with. I'm not sure why more people don't use a top coat, and of course I cover this in my installation video. So definitely another layer that you can use to prevent against mold and mildew. Let's talk about UV fade protection, because ultraviolet damage is definitely a real thing when it comes to epoxy. Epoxy is a polymer. It's basically a plastic, and plastic is susceptible to sunlight damage. The epoxy that I've spread has a little bit of clouding going on right in this area here. You can see there's some sunlight still creeping in from my garage door windows in this area right here. But sometimes I leave this door open, and so this whole area gets blanketed in direct sunlight, and as a result, it's starting to get a little bit cloudy. And that is a pretty common problem with epoxy when it's in direct sunlight. It can get cloudy, it can fade, it can start to yellow or amber. The problem is there is no totally foolproof way to protect against ultraviolet damage for epoxy that is exposed to direct sunlight. Any epoxy that advertises UV fade protection will eventually yellow or fade or get damaged if it's exposed long enough. The only way to really protect your epoxy is to add a top coat, specifically one that has a polyurea or a polyurethane formula that's specifically indicated for UV protection. Again, that's in the top coat, not the epoxy itself. Any top coat will give you an advantage against all kinds of stains, fading, chemical spills, because you can repair the top coat. You can sand it down, you can buff it out, you can scrub it, and then you can ultimately bring it back to life, and you're not doing any damage to the epoxy itself. You're just working with a top coat. So now we come to the biggest question of all, which is strength. Epoxies have a lot of different ways of trying to tell you how strong their product is, but when I was researching, the thing that I focused on was solids content. Essentially, higher grade epoxies have a higher solids content. Lower grade epoxies have more water or liquids. If you think of paint, for example, as your starting point, just a typical wall paint, that's going to be about 90% liquid, aka water, and the rest, the 10%, is some kind of a plastic compound. Once upon a time it was lead, now it's plastic or acrylic, so when you put it on the wall, 90% of it is going to evaporate and the rest is going to harden. You're left with a layer or film of paint. You step that up to an entry-level epoxy, but really it's just a floor paint. Now you're at 15 to 20% solids. The rest is going to evaporate, and then 15 to 20% of it is going to harden when you spread it. You want to step up again to a DIY, off-the-shelf epoxy kit. This is the first kind of level where we're actually talking about epoxy. Still, we're only at about 30% solids. You spread that on the floor, 30% of it hardens. The rest of it, 70%, is still going to evaporate because it's still a liquid. Industrial grade epoxies can get as high as 100% solids. Basically what that means is when you take an epoxy and you mix it with a hardener and you spread it on the ground, nothing evaporates. It only hardens. So whatever thickness you're spreading it at, it stays at that thickness and it only hardens. A typical brand of off-the-shelf epoxy is about the thickness of one sheet of paper. This is regular old 20-pound copy paper. And then epoxy that is 100% solids is about the thickness of 3 sheets of paper. In either case, the total thickness is less than 1 millimeter. Now you might hear all this and think, uh-oh, these epoxies are all a lot thinner than I thought they would be. And that's understandable. But you also see why it's important to really make sure that your surface is prepared well and you're getting the highest quality epoxy that you can. You might also be tempted to think, well, maybe I'll do 2 coats. Can't do that. True epoxy is only indicated for 1 coat, and if the instructions say that you can do more than 1 coat, that's because it's not a real epoxy, it's more of a paint. How do some epoxies claim that they're 20 times stronger than other epoxies? Well, the specific epoxy that makes that claim uses a resin in their formula, and that resin technically makes it harder on the surface than a conventional epoxy, but it doesn't make it thicker. Industrial epoxies are still going to be 100% solids. They're still going to be a thicker epoxy. And I'm not saying that the other off-the-shelf epoxies are not going to give you protection on your garage floor. I'm just saying that if you're going to go to the time and effort and spend the money, it's best to know what you're getting and not get hoodwinked. So this epoxy has been sitting in my shed for about 9 months since I did this floor. And this is the raw epoxy that has not yet been mixed with the hardener. You can see some of it has spilled out of the jug. And if I touch it, I don't know if you can see that, but it's still tacky, right? It still comes off on my hand. It hasn't dried. It will only harden when it's mixed with a catalyst. I'm not a scientist. This is not a science YouTube channel. I'm just trying to communicate that when this epoxy is spread, because it's not drying, it is not reducing the weight of the epoxy. It's not going to thin because nothing evaporates. This product is called Armorclad. They have not sponsored this video or compensated me financially in any way. This is just the product I like best. When I was doing my research, I could have chosen any epoxy to present to you today, but this is the one that I thought was the best value for consumer DIY folks like us. You can get it with, the kit that has all the stuff that you'll need in it. It has, the decorative flakes, has gizmos and gadgets like the stirring stuff and the cleats that you need to walk across the floor. And I have linked it in my description. It's also on my storefront. If you would like to support this video, using my links is the best way to do it. Another thing I like about this particular product is that the epoxy and the hardener come in separate containers, so you can use as much or as little as you want at a time. Whereas a lot of the DIY kits, the hardener and the epoxy are together in the same pouch and they're separated by some kind of a membrane. And when you're ready to go, you break the membrane, you mix everything together, and then you spread it on the floor. But that means you have to do everything all at once. So once you commit, you got to finish the job. Otherwise, you're in trouble. With this stuff, you can start with as little as you want. The manufacturer recommends start with no more than a half of the container to mix up, for your first go. I recommend you start with no more than a quarter of the container until you really get a feel for, how easily it spreads, whether you want to add a thinning agent or something like that, which I do recommend. You can work at your own pace, and it kind of like takes the pressure off of you a little bit. And if you want to finish the job on another day, you can do that as well. Well, the knees have recovered, so here we are again. All the items that you would need to do an epoxy project I have linked in the description below. I also have a video on how to resurface and apply all this stuff that is hopefully very simple and to the point. I try really hard not to waste your time and just to be as honest as I can. Thank you for building with me today, and I'll see you on the next project.